The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.
Mr. Carter is acting as if he hadn't been in charge for the past 3.5 years, as if someone else ran up nearly $200 billion in federal red ink, was responsible for the largest deficit, including off-budget items in American history.
A Reagan campaign commercial in 1980, illustrating how things change in American politics. Now it's the president who's being blamed for the largest deficits in the nation's history. How do those deficits impact the economy? We'll look at that tonight. Good evening. While most members of Congress were home for the holidays last week, Senate Finance Committee Chairman Robert Dole of Kansas was in Washington playing the Capitol's favorite year-end game. That game, of course, what do we do about the deficits? Senator Dole is worrying a lot about the deficits these days, so he held hearings on the subject last week, hearings that were boycotted by the Reagan administration, which apparently is worrying much less than some politicians are. In that group of worried politicians worried about the deficit, some would like to raise taxes to attack the deficit. Of course, most of them aren't running for re-election next year, as are most members of Congress. Some others would like to cut spending, but there is little agreement in Washington about where and how much to cut. Most everyone else, it seems, is content with the economy rolling along nicely at the moment to play what's being called the deficit waiting game. You can count in that number Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. Within the federal government itself, only the White House chief economist Martin Feldstein is agitating for any quick action on the deficits, and now, by most accounts, he's in the administration doghouse. Tonight, as that record federal deficit continues to grow day by day, we look at how serious the problem has become. And of course, there's even a difference of opinion on that. So we begin tonight with what no self-respecting discussion of the federal deficit would be without, namely some good old-fashioned political rhetoric.
We are incurring a deficit, Mr. President, at the rate of $22 million an hour. That means by the time these hearings conclude on Wednesday, we will have incurred an additional $1 billion in national debt.
Ignoring the problem of the deficit in 1984 is somewhat like ignoring an elephant which happens to be in your living room. I don't think that it can be done.
Most of the recent debate over the deficit has centered on Martin Feldstein, the Reagan administration's chief economist. He thinks the deficit is a problem that needs an immediate plan of action. And as the cartoonists have found, that's put him at odds with almost everyone else in the administration, including the president.
That it's very important that we get budget deficits moving down sharply.
Any way you slice it, the Reagan deficit is huge, now officially larger than the deficits of all other American presidents combined. Someone calculated that the '83 deficit alone breaks down to $836 for every man, woman, and child in the country.
The deficit problem is very serious. It's not a short-term problem. Essentially, our fiscal processes are out of control.
What it portends for our economy, if we don't do something about it, is rising interest rates, rising inflation, rising unemployment, stagnation, snuffing out the recovery.
Yet, despite all of the political hand-wringing, the attack on the deficit remains high-centered. Democratic House Speaker Tip O'Neill saying it's the president's problem. He must draft the solution. And Mr. Reagan firmly resisting the tax increase spending cut package that's been devised by members of his own party.
Let them keep their hands off the recovery and start doing what they were elected to do, which is to get spending under control once and for all.
The president will say, well, if you'll cut these programs that I told you to cut, we wouldn't have the problem. That's sort of begging the question. You can't have your own way in the Congress where you have a Democratic-controlled House and a Republican-controlled Senate. You have to be flexible and willing to compromise.
But what Dole calls his modest package of spending cuts and tax increases died as the Congress adjourned last month. Idaho Republican Senator James McClure says the deficit is a pressing problem, so pressing that he might go along with tax hikes, but only if they accompany equal spending cuts.
I am opposed to increased taxation. That is not the answer to our problem. We tried that before. You don't get economic recovery by increasing the burden of government. You get economic recovery by allowing the private sector to stimulate the economy. Increasing taxes is the wrong medicine. It'll make the disease worse. But I can accept it if, but only if, we get equal or greater amounts of savings. And I say that only because I recognize that Tip O'Neill believes that government ought to grow. We ought to have bigger government, we ought to have more of it, and we ought to pay for it. So he's in favor of increasing taxes, increasing the size of government. We in the Senate and the administration are saying, that's the wrong way to go. We already have more government than we can afford to pay for. Let's cut it down and don't raise taxes. Well, that impasse means nothing gets changed. And in order to break the impasse, I would do some things I would not otherwise do, because I think we just simply can't both sit on our own particular point of view and allow the country to go to ruin.
But Idaho's other Republican senator gives no indication that he's ready to go for that sort of compromise.
Well, I think that there will be another attempt to raise taxes again, and I hope we'll be able to thwart that and try to emphasize we need to cut spending, that we're not going to do any good by raising taxes as long as we continue to spend. In other words, whether you raise taxes, borrow the money, or print it, i.e. steal it from the people through inflation, it still costs the citizen of the country, the consumer out there, money. And the only way that that citizen, I think, is going to be treated equitably and fairly is to reduce spending, and that's the only way we're going to reduce interest rates, and that's the way we're going to keep the engine of prosperity running, to generate more growth in the economy and hopefully start paying back some of that debt.
54% of the federal budget is in entitlements programs, and a large chunk of that is Social Security. But it's the growth in those programs that causes the problems as we look at 85, 86, 87 and the future years, because those programs are still growing at 15% a year. We've heard so much about these terrible Reagan budget cuts, the great pain caused people, and you could scarcely read a newspaper or watch a television show without seeing somebody, some poor person who is being hurt by the Reagan budget cuts. You know, the rate of growth in those entitlements programs has been reduced from 16% a year to 15% a year. And that's all. And we must get there. That means that the expenditure in those programs 5 years from now will be double what they are now. 10 years from now, they'll be 4 times what they are now. And it's that issue of compounding growth in the entitlements programs that we must address. There's no way to avoid that.
I'm prepared to vote to cut spending across the board, and defense would have to take some of those cuts, but also entitlements. I think it's that important and that dramatic that we make the bold moves necessary to get the budget under control by reducing spending.
In 1980, while campaigning for the Senate seat he now holds, Sims was sharply critical of Democrat Frank Church for helping create what at the time seemed like a huge deficit, $67 billion. In 1980, Sims blamed most of the country's economic woes on the Democratic deficit and supported the Reagan promise to balance the budget by 1984.
In Washington, he votes against balancing the budget and against tax incentives that would encourage production. That's why I think we need a change in the 80s. It's nothing personal. It's just a matter that the politics of the 60s and the 70s have gone by the wayside.
Now, in 1983, with a Republican president, a Republican Senate, and a near $200 billion deficit, how does Sims square that old budget balancing rhetoric with the current economic reality?
I think you're asking the right question. That's the question I ask my colleagues all the time, and that's why I'm continuing to oppose increasing the national debt as the last way to try to avoid excessive spending. I think we have to, this is a very perilous problem presented by the American people, and I think that it calls for bold, decisive action, which we're not getting enough of, and I'm sad to say that there are members in my party and my own president that is not, I think, aggressive enough on attacking the budget. And I think if we could get Ronald Reagan to attack the budget with the same enthusiasm that he liberated Grenada, that we could solve this problem.
3 perspectives now on what impact the federal deficit is having, or perhaps will have, on the economy, and what might be done to reduce the deficit and consequently the impact. Our first view tonight comes from Joe Waka, the Associate Dean of the School of Business at Idaho State University in Pocatello. Dr. Waka joins us tonight in Pocatello. Dr. Waka, I said a moment ago that both Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill are, for all practical purposes, setting out this concern about the deficit. Should they be more concerned?
I think there is a cause for concern, not so much because the The deficit is a destabilizing force today, but rather what it bodes for the future. Indeed, the federal government's fiscal policy today is a stimulative policy. Running the deficit pumps more money into the economy than the federal government takes out. That can have a positive effect on the economy in the sense of creating demands for goods and services, and thus creating jobs. I would, and I think virtually all economists would look at the deficit in relation to the utilization rate in the economy. We certainly don't want big deficits when the economy is working at full employment and when plants are working at full capacity. And that is a point at which the deficit can have a terrible effect on the economy, and that's what portends for the future beyond 1984 unless the problem is addressed.
Excuse me, when you say a terrible effect, what do you mean?
Well, if the labor force and the plant capacity in the country is fully utilized, and if the government comes in with more demands for more additional goods for defense or whatever, you can't work the plants and the people beyond their capacity, and then there's only one way for prices to go, and that's up. Inflation. Right.
Which happened, 10 years ago or so, when we first started the big round of inflation.
Yes, that's true. There are certain parallels that might be drawn going back as far as the late 60s, when President Johnson chose to finance the Vietnam conflict not by raising taxes and financing it out of current revenues, but by borrowing. That got us on a wild path of gyrations from which we're just now recovering.
Well, let me just ask you finally and quickly, when should we get really worried about this? If obviously you're suggesting, as I think most people are, that there is no negative impact right now on the economy, when is that likely to happen?
Well, I think that's a particular role for us as economists, even as the economy is improving and we get nice new numbers virtually daily about retail sales and lower unemployment rate. We have to remind the policymakers now that they must take action. They must begin to plan for the future, and that future, when we have to take some corrective steps, I think is late in calendar year 1984.
We'll come back, sir. Thank you. Let's get a different view of this now from Dr. Don Billings, a professor of economics at Boise State University in Boise. Dr. Walker says there's a long-term danger, maybe late next year. You buy that?
Well, I think what he's referring to is as the economy approaches capacity and the federal government will be in the money and capital markets having to borrow all of this money, it will potentially crowd out the private sector through increases in real interest rates, crowding out the private sector and maybe bringing this recovery to a premature...
In other words, the government will need so much money to finance this deficit that there won't be enough for you and me to take a loan to buy a house or something.
Currently, the federal government is borrowing in excess of half of the total net savings in the American economy, which would be personal savings plus business savings in the form of retained earnings and that kind of thing. It's expected it could reach 70 or 80% of total net savings. The federal government, when it borrows, has no limit to the interest rate it pays because it can just borrow more to pay that interest. But the private sector borrower, Boise Cascade or you and I, it's a much more fundamental constraint on our behavior than the federal government. So you have this phenomenon that's referred to as the crowding out problem, where the private sector gets crowded out as a result of rising real interest rates.
And economist Martin Feldstein, the White House economist, says that could mean another recessionary cycle in 1985.
It could mean an early termination of this recovery. Historically, recoveries last 3 years, maybe 3.5 years. We would only be into the second year by the end of next year. So one would have to call that a premature termination. It's a possibility. Personally, I think one of the things that's not referred to very often, although I think Dr. Feldstein has from time to time, is that one of the implications of this is this crowding out is at the expense, in large part, of plant and equipment, modernizing our capital infrastructure in the United States, and that this cost will be borne down the road, not next year, but 5 years, 10 years, as we're now concerned with the competitiveness against the Japanese and the Germans and that kind of thing. And that's the real long-term danger.
Okay, let me ask you this. This is the tough question. Senator Dole, as you know, is proposing, and Senator McClure seemed to be saying essentially the same thing on the videotape a moment ago, that a tax increase might be necessary to get a handle on this. Do you disagree?
Well, that hurts bad to even entertain that possibility, but there's another fundamental problem here, a fatal erosion in the faith of the government apparatus, that if we now, with an election just slightly less than a year away, if paralysis sets in, as it looks like it might very well do, for a whole year, the American people's confidence in their government, in the governmental process, will suffer severely. In that context, I might be, as McClure said, Senator McClure said, be willing to entertain some notion of revenue enhancement and budget plugs and some of these things they're talking about, but that really does hurt in the sense that ultimately it's the spending side of government that measures the impact on the economy. That when government spends, that money and those resources that it absorbs are not available to the private sector. Ultimately, we must turn the rate of growth in spending. When Carter left office, government spending, federal spending, was slightly more than 22% of the gross national product. Today, after 4 years of Mr. Reagan, it's over 25%, higher than it's, of course, ever been.
But if I'm hearing you right, Dr. Billings, a tax increase would be the very last of many options that should be entertained.
Down deep, I would like to take the position that Mr. Sims did and just hang tough and not do it. Maybe the American people, somehow the politicians would wake up. I'm not very confident of that. But the paralysis over this next year has tremendous adverse impacts on the confidence of the American people in the government.
Well, let me just ask you real quickly, and finally, Senator Sims says that Congress should just refuse to increase the debt limit, and that would bring the problem right to a head.
Well, of course, they won't do that.
Also bring the government to a halt.
We had that happen a couple months ago, where there were a few days there where they literally had to postpone the writing of checks. So the Congress, of course, won't do that. We've got a fundamental defect in democracy, and I'm not sure what the answer is. I think 32 states have now passed a resolution calling for a constitutional convention to deal with an amendment to the Constitution which would establish a budgetary limit and balance the budget tax limits. I don't know what the answer is. It's very frustrating.
We'll come back, sir. Thank you. Finally now, a banker's view of all of this, and that comes from Dale Blickenstaff, Executive Vice President of Idaho First National Bank in Boise. Dr. Billings says he would like to be a purist and say no tax increase. Where do you come down on that question?
I guess I have to agree with him, Mark. We'll never solve the problem in either the short run, maybe in the short run, but not the long run, by increasing taxes, because Congress, I think, will never, I use the word behave, and control spending.
In other words, the revenue that would be generated from a tax increase would just be eaten up with new spending.
Well, we've heard the same. We've heard this before. We've heard we'll cut the spending and we'll have a little modest tax increase, but the spending cuts never occur. And that's, in my view, is the only way to solve this problem. And Congress and the President are not facing up to the only solution that's really, I think, available to us to solve the problem.
Do you agree with the analysis that's been provided here so far about the longer-term impact of keeping this deficit at the level it's at now?
Yes, Mark, I think it's a very serious matter. But then let's ask the question. Dr. Billings mentioned we've gone from 23% up to perhaps 25 or 26. I'm not sure the number, but if you look at statistics, you see the deficit over a period of time has been a very high percentage of gross national product. My concern is that the American people have all of a sudden become indifferent and complacent. First, they don't believe Congress will do anything, and here we've had a year of 3.5% rate of inflation with a $300 billion deficit. And I think the average American might well say, well, maybe deficits aren't harmful. Maybe we can go ahead and spend the money. And if the American people become indifferent and apathetic about the problem, believing that first it won't be solved, and then perhaps things aren't so bad now.
Maybe it doesn't need to be solved.
Maybe it doesn't need to be solved. You know, I would be opposed to a constitutional convention or referendum to insist that you have to have balanced budgets, because I think that can lead to lots of problems. But it may be the only way that we're going to get the attention of Congress to solve this problem.
Mr. Blickenstaff, do you think it'd be likely that if things stay the way they are now and there is no political solution, be it a combination of tax increases and spending cuts or whatever, that we'll see an interest rate increase by this time in 1984?
Oh, perhaps not in '84. Dr. Billings mentioned the percentage of savings that the federal government is using. The private sector today, the corporations are not really borrowing very much money. If you compare it to a year ago, the total short-term credit demand is well below that of a year ago. There's lots of liquidity. When the private sector and the public sector, when the conflict occurs, when the shortage of funds occurs, we will see it. And I think it's important for people to realize that with the deregulation that's occurred in financial institutions, Reg Q is gone. There's no ceiling on interest rates anymore. If we have another round of inflation that we saw in the last 2 years ago, prime hit what, 21%?
Right.
There's no limit on the cost of funds, and prime could go to 25, 28, 30%.
Sky's the limit.
Sky's the limit.
Well, let me open this up, gentlemen, and go back to Dr. Waka and Pocatello. First on the tax cut, or the tax increase question and the spending cut scenario. 2 votes here against a tax increase. Where do you come down on that?
Well, I think we have to move on both fronts, and I think it's important that we recognize where we are on the spending side. Let me just run some figures by you here and show you what kind of spending cuts would have to be made if you were to approach it solely on that side. Right now, federal budget outlays are running at about $850 billion. Interest rate or interest payments on the debt take about $104 billion out of that, leaving what you might call a controllable part of federal outlays of about $750 billion. National defense takes about $250 billion out of that, leaving about $500 billion.
We should mention the President's made it clear that he won't tolerate any cuts in the defense budget.
That's right. So we're left with all the other operations of government, including the health and income security programs, which have been alluded to already. I think what we observe is a real reluctance to bite heavily into those programs. But say we cut those by 10%. That would leave us, all other functions of government comprise about $140 billion. That means if you really went out to eliminate the deficit, you would have to virtually shut down all of the rest of the government if you focused on the spending side. That means the administration of justice, law enforcement, educational programs, air traffic control, highway construction.
So the logic of your argument is the same as Senator Dole is making, I guess, that you have to attack it on both the spending and the revenue side.
Yes, and I don't think they should be, where I would differ is tying the two together to say we'll only cut taxes, or we will only increase taxes if we cut spending. We'll only cut spending if we increase taxes. I think the way the process is structured in Washington, and I've had the fortunate or unfortunate experience of participating in that structure in the Bureau of the Budget and Council of Economic Advisors. It's a very long, tedious, cumbersome process, and I think it would be well if we had more people stepping out to urge us to make the hard choices on income security programs and face up to the real probability of the necessity of a tax increase probably to take effect in '85. It can't be done solely on the spending side.
Let me get some comment from these other gentlemen about that. Dr. Billings, can't be done, he says, on the
well, I think the numbers clearly indicated have to come out of defense and/or the entitlements programs, and so you have some very, very tough decisions. Mr. Reagan's unprepared to deal with this. This defense spending schedule, the latest figure I saw for fiscal '85, they're now throwing around is $305 billion. That's $20 billion above what it was just a few months ago. As Dr. Walk pointed out earlier, I guess it was on the TV tape that entitlement programs are increasing at 15% per annum. The Reagan defense spending is increasing at 10, 11% per annum. If you take the 3% inflation this year, this means an increase in real defense expenditures of 7 or 8%. That I agree with Dr. Walk that what we have to do is make these inroads in defense and the entitlement programs. And if we get moving...
But he's saying you have to raise taxes, too, at the same time.
Well, if we get moving in the right direction with respect to spending, I think it would have impacts on capital and financial markets and interest rates. The 1 out of $8 of, as he pointed out, of the $850 billion budget, over 100 of it is interest payments alone. That a 1 or 2% fall in long-term rates and short-term rates would reduce that by 10, 15, 20 $billion. That if we started moving in the right direction, I think that would make a significant move.
Mr. Blickenstaff?
Well, Mark, I think realistically we're probably going to have to increase taxes, but I don't like the sound of it. But I think the monkey is on the president's back. He's got to provide the leadership in this area. He started out in 1980, and we heard what he said. The people believed him. I don't think he's achieved it. He's got to cut defense spending, and if he doesn't cut defense spending, the House of Representatives will never support him on any entitlement cuts. And we're going to go on down this road and have $400 billion and $500 billion deficits if the president doesn't take a position and give up on some defense spending. That's the only way it's going to get started.
Dr. Walker, just quickly, how did we get in this place? Is it the big tax cut in 1981? Is that what caused this? Is it the recession? Is it a combination of both?
The tax cut is part of it. Federal receipts as a percent of GNP have gone down from over 20% to just slightly over 18% this year. So we gave ourselves a healthy tax cut, but then the expansion of spending in connection with that leads to a large deficit. Federal receipts fall from 82 to 83 by $17 billion. At the same time, spending is rising by $67 billion.
Right. Well, in a partisan way, is it right to blame this on the president?
I think, again, given the process that occurs in Washington, I think Mr. Blickenstaff is absolutely right. The president has to take a leadership position. There will not be any kind of a tax adjustment take place unless the president gets out and does it. And I think if he said on a Monday that he was for it, Congress could put something in place by Friday. Perhaps not that quick, but in terms of that process, it could be done very, very quickly.
Is this due to the tax cut, Don Billings?
Not really. As Dr. Walker pointed out, revenues between 82 and 83 down only about $20 billion. Personal income tax collections only about half of that, about $10 billion. And as he said, the spending was up by close to $70 billion. It is spending that's out of control. And until we do something about that, and again, I would like to repeat this one more time, is that this long-run implication for the rate of capital accumulation, the rate of investment in new plant and equipment, productivity up until this year, since about 1975, for 7, 8 years, man-hour productivity literally was flat, no gains at all. The ratio of the capital stock to the labor force, which is a measure of the productivity possibilities in the labor force, not increasing, declining. The great increase in participation rates of women and things in terms of the growth in the labor force.
I'm sorry, our time has gone unreasonably fast, it seems like. Dr. Walker, we thank you for joining us in Pocatello tonight. Appreciate it.